The Supermarine Spitfire, one of the most famous and even the best fighters of World War II, was developed under R. Mitchell. After his death in 1937, the work was headed by J. Smith. After leaving school at the age of 16, he entered the locomotive building firm of Kerr, Stewart & Co. in Stoke-on-Trent as an apprentice, then worked for the same firm as a draftsman while studying mathematics and mechanics at night school. In 1917 he joined the Supermarine Aviation Works and in 1919 was appointed its chief designer, in 1920 chief engineer and finally in 1927 technical director, without any higher education. Between 1920 and 1936 Mitchell designed 24 airplane models, including the famous Supermarine Spitfire. Mitchell retired in early 1937 due to advanced cancer, but continued to oversee testing of new models until his last days. In 1942 Mitchell's life was immortalized in the film The First of the Few, directed and starring Mitchell by Leslie Howard. 2 biographical books about Mitchell were written by his son Gordon Mitchell. Joseph Smith, May 25, 1897 to February 20, 1956, was an English aircraft designer who took over as chief designer of Supermarine after the death of R.J. Mitchell and led the team responsible for the subsequent development of the Supermarine Spitfire. Flight specifications of the Supermarine Spitfire Mk.IA. Engine, Rolls-Royce Merlin 3. Power, HP, 1030. Wingspan, m. 11,23. Length of aircraft, m. 9.12. Aircraft height, m. 3.02. Wing area, square m. 2,5. Weight, kg. Empty aircraft, 1953. Takeoff weight, 2,692. Maximal speed, km/h/altitude, 582/5669. Rate of climb, m/s, 11. Practical ceiling, m. 10,485. Flying range, km. 680. Supermarine Spitfire history of creation. The development of the project began with the Type 224, a monoplane fighter with stowable landing gear and a State Hawk engine. It was tested in February 1934, but never put into mass production. During the further development, the project evolved into the Type 300, all-metal plane with retractable landing gear, PV.12 engine, future Merlin, and a thin, elliptical wing. The F.37/34 specification was prepared for this project, later transformed into the F.1035. The latter considerably reduced the flight time, i.e. it was assumed to get a fighter interceptor with armament powerful for its time, 6 to 8 7.7 mm machine guns. By August of 1935 the project was ready and construction of the prototype began. Tests of the future Spitfire began on March 6, 1936. After making minor changes based on the results of the first flights, the prototype reached a speed of 560 km per hour. On June 3, 1936 the Air Ministry ordered the first batch of 310 fighters. The machines were to be built to the corrected specification of F-1636. To satisfy the specification it was necessary to increase wing stiffness. Because of the Supermarine Company's insufficient production capacity, the production was organized in close cooperation with other companies who supplied components and parts. Nevertheless, the schedule could not be met. The first Spitfire, instead of October 1937, was released in March 1938. Further evolution of the design led to 2 large families of Spitfires, with Merlin and Griffin engines. Total production was approximately 22,000 aircraft, including 2,400 seafair deck fighters. Main modifications of Supermarine Spitfire. Spitfire Mk.I, Merlin 2 engine, 1030 HP, on the first 174 aircraft or Merlin 3 on the rest. Armament, 8 7.7 mm Browning Mk.I machine guns. The 24 Spitfire Mk.IBs delivered in the summer of 1940 were armed with 2 20 mm British Hispano guns, 60 rounds per gun. Total production was 1,567 aircraft, 1,517 by Supermarine until March 1941 and 50 by Westland in July-September 1941. Spitfire Mk.2, Merlin 12 engine, 1,175 HP. Armament, 8 7.7mm machine guns, Mk.IIA, 751 aircraft, or 2 20mm guns and 4 7.7mm machine guns, Mk.IIB, 170 vehicles. Deliveries began in June 1940. The CBAF plant produced 921 machines. 50 aircraft in 1942 were converted to a search and rescue variant of the ASR Mk.2, carrying signal smoke bombs as well as a drop-in inflatable boat. Spitfire Mk.V, Merlin 45 engine, 1,470 HP, other modifications, 46, 50, 50A, 55, 56, were also installed during production. 154 aircraft were converted from Mk.I and Mk.2 Spitfires. In March-June 1941, Supermarine produced 94 Mk.VA machines armed with 8 7.7mm machine guns. The main sub-variety was the Mk.VB, armed with 2 20mm guns and 4 7.7mm machine guns, 3,911 aircraft. The Mk.VC, 2,467 aircraft, had a unified wing, so that both pure machine gun and cannon armament could be mounted. It was not used in practice, but most aircraft received a mixed version corresponding to the Mk.VB, but with an increased number of rounds per gun, from 60 to 120 rounds per barrel. A total of 6,479 Mk.V Spitfires, 1,348 Supermarine, 4,504 CBAF, and 635 Westland, were produced, including 15 photo reconnaissance aircraft. Spitfire Mk.VI is a high-altitude version with a hermetic cabin and Merlin 47 engine, 1,415 HP. Armament, by Type B. Since December 1941, Supermarine produced 100 aircraft. Spitfire Mk.7, high-altitude version with increased wingspan, hermetic cabin, and Merlin engine 64, 1,710 HP, designated FMK.7, or 71, HFMK.7. Armament was of Type C. Since August 1942, 140 machines were built by the Supermarine Company. The Spitfire Mk.8 was created as a modification of the Mk.7. Without the hermetic cabin. It was produced in 3 versions, depending on the engine: low-altitude LFMK.8, Merlin 66, 1,580 HP, medium-altitude FMK.8, Merlin 63 or 63A, and high-altitude HFMK.8, Merlin 70. The first series had extended wingtips, as on Mk.7, later normal wingtips were used. Armament was of Type C. Also there was a 227 kg bomb under fuselage and 2 113 kg under wings. Produced from the spring of 1943, 1,658 aircrafts were built. The Spitfire Mk.9 was conceived as a transitional variant, a simple adaptation of the Mk.V glider for Merlin 60 series engines, but eventually became one of the most mass-produced versions and was produced until April 1945. From June 1942 the Mk.V was converted into this variant, and from the end of the year production of new 9s began. They were produced in 3 versions: FMK.9, engine Merlin 61, and then 63 or 63A, normal or shortened wingtips, LFMK.9, built since early 1943, Merlin 66, shortened wingtips, HFMK.9, appeared in early 1944, Merlin 70, normal wingtips. A number of changes were made during production: a new widened rudder, additional fuselage tank behind the pilot's cockpit, new gyroscopic sight, retractable tail wheel, and a drop-shaped cockpit lantern were installed. The aircraft was originally equipped in C-type, but later introduced enhanced E-type wing allowing installation of 2 20mm guns, 120 rounds each, and 2 12.7mm machine guns, 250 rounds each. The production of 5,656 Mk.9 Spitfires, 561 by Supermarine and 5095 by CBAF. Combat use of Spitfire Supermarines. The 19th and 66th AES were the first to master the Spitfires. By the beginning of World War II, the Royal Air Force received 306 of these planes. They managed to rearm 10 squadrons. But Spitfires were not included in the expeditionary forces in France, they were saving them for the metropolis air defense. During the whole period of the Strange War, Spitfires were engaged only occasionally. Since May 13, 1940, they participated in the fighting over the Netherlands and northern France, and then covered the evacuation from Dunkirk. The Spitfires went into battle in true mass during the Battle of Britain. By its beginning, July 10, 1940, the fighter command had 247 of these aircraft. A total of 19 squadrons of Spitfires participated in the battle. They accounted for 43% of the enemy planes shot down, including more than half of the fighters. It was Spitfires that had to bear the brunt of fights with Messerschmitts. Hurricanes could not compete on equal terms with Bf-109E. The Spitfire was superior to the Bf-109E in low-altitude speed and horizontal maneuverability, but the Messerschmitt had better climb rate and faster dive acceleration. In 1941 and the first months of 1942, the Spitfires were based exclusively in the metropolis. A sharp decline in Luftwaffe activity over Britain allowed the Royal Air Force to turn to offensive action. Spitfires Mk.I, and later Mk.V were used to escort bombers and attack targets in northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. However, their effectiveness in such operations was limited by the insufficient range. In March 1942, 15 Spitfires Mk.VB were sent to Malta, the first aircraft of this type to be transported outside Malta. In all, 367 fighters were flown to Malta, considerably reinforcing the air defense system of this most important British base in the Mediterranean. Beginning in May 1942, Spitfires fought in Egypt and Libya. By the time of the decisive offensive against the Italian-German forces in Tunisia in early 1943, 10 Spitfires squadrons were operating here. In the closing stages of fighting in Tunisia, Spitfires Mk.8 appeared and later took part in the battles in Sicily and southern Italy. In 1944, the Spitfires Mk.8 began to be used in Burma. By the end of the war, there were about 10 squadrons with Spitfires and bombers used mostly as fighter bombers. The Spitfire became a true symbol of the Royal Air Force during World War II. This aircraft proved to be an extremely successful fighter with enormous reserves for development. Suffice it to say that the power of the power plants used on the Spitfire practically doubled during production. They managed to create on its basis a fairly good World War II deck fighter, the Seafire. In aerial combat, the Spitfire was quite capable of withstanding the German Bf-109 and Italian fighters.